Bindi Irwin in her first TV interview since her diagnosis with endometriosis.
When I got out of surgery, the first thing he said to me was, "How did you live with that much pain?" That validation meant so much to me.
A photo landed on Instagram this March that made millions of people stop scrolling. It was Bindi Irwin, lying in a hospital bed, the same young woman who grew up on our screens as the cheerful little girl in khaki, chasing crocodiles beside her dad. No context. No warning. Just a hospital gown, and 4-line, and a caption that sent fans straight into panic mode. Comment sections filled up within minutes. Is she okay? What happened to her? Why does this keep happening? But here's what almost nobody caught in that first wave of worry. That photo wasn't new. And once you understand why she posted it, and what she's actually been living through for more than a decade, the whole story changes. This isn't a mystery. It's a paper trail, written across 2 continents, 3 surgeries, and 51 pieces of tissue that never should have been growing inside her body in the first place. So let's actually walk through it, from the beginning, because the real story is far more remarkable than a scary photo on a timeline. Start on March 7, 2023. Bindi Irwin, then 24 years old, posted something to her nearly 6 million followers that she had never said publicly before. She had endometriosis. And she had already had surgery for it, 4 days earlier. For a decade, one of the most photographed young women on the planet had been carrying a chronic illness in complete silence, smiling through wildlife documentaries, red carpets, a wedding, and the birth of her daughter, while something inside her body was quietly getting worse. If the word endometriosis is unfamiliar, here's the simple version. It's a condition where tissue similar to the lining of the uterus starts growing in places it doesn't belong, attaching itself to organs, causing inflammation, scarring, and pain that can show up almost anywhere in the body. It affects an enormous number of women worldwide, and yet it remains one of the most poorly understood and most frequently dismissed conditions in medicine. There's no simple blood test for it. There's no scan that instantly confirms it. Which means diagnosis often depends entirely on whether a doctor is willing to keep looking instead of sending a patient home with a shrug. For Bindi, getting an actual answer meant leaving Australia entirely. She flew roughly 10,000 miles from her home to New York City, to one very specific operating room at the Setkin Endometriosis Center inside Lenox Hill Hospital. The surgeon there, Dr. Tamer Setkin, is one of the most respected excision specialists in the world and co-founded the Endometriosis Foundation of America. People don't cross oceans for a routine appointment. They do it when they've run out of other options and finally found someone who might actually listen. And what he found justified the trip. Over several hours in the operating room, Dr. Setkin removed 37 separate lesions from her body, along with what's known as a chocolate cyst, an ovarian cyst filled with old, darkened blood that had been quietly damaging her from the inside. 37 lesions is not a small number. Each one represents tissue that had been forming and scarring for years, completely invisible from the outside, while the version of Bindi Irwin the public saw kept showing up cheerful, composed, and camera-ready. That contrast is worth sitting with for a second. Through Dancing with the Stars, through her engagement and wedding to Chandler Powell, through the arrival of her daughter Grace in 2021, through every wildlife segment filmed at Australia Zoo, this was happening underneath the surface the entire time. She later described getting the diagnosis as one of the most validating moments of her life, which sounds like an unusual reaction to being told you have a chronic, currently incurable condition. But once you understand what came before it, that reaction makes complete sense. Validation wasn't a consolation prize for her. It was the first time in 10 years that someone had looked inside her body and confirmed that what she'd been feeling was real. So what actually happened during those 10 years? What were doctors telling her while the disease kept advancing? In interviews since her diagnosis, Bindi has been unusually direct about this part of the story, and it is, frankly, the part that should frustrate you the most. She's described being told, more than once, that this was simply something women deal with. She's talked about doctors suggesting she try meditation or relax with a cup of tea in the evenings, as though chronic, worsening pain was a mood to be managed rather than a physical condition to be treated. She said she was tested for nearly everything else first. Tropical diseases, Lyme disease, cancer, blood tests and scans that came back clean over and over, while the actual cause sat undiscovered because nobody was looking in the right place. In one interview, she summed up her daily reality in plain terms: nausea, irritable bowel symptoms, sharp stabbing pain, cramping, and exhaustion, arriving almost every single day, for years. That's not an occasional bad afternoon. That's a body sending distress signals on a loop for a decade, while professional after professional offered reassurance instead of investigation. Bindi has said this pain traces back to her early teenage years, more than a decade before that first Instagram post. Which means the joyful girl audiences watched grow up on television was already dealing with this long before anyone outside her family had any idea. And there's a bigger question: if one of the most recognizable, most resourced young women in Australia, someone with access to specialists most people could never reach, still had to fight for 10 years just to get taken seriously, what happens to the millions of women who don't have her platform, her connections, or her ability to fly across the world for a diagnosis? That's not a rhetorical flourish. It's the actual reason she says she decided to go public in the first place, to hand other women the validation she went a decade without. For a while, it genuinely looked like the story had a clean ending. The surgery happened, the truth came out, and life moved forward. Then May 10, 2025 arrived, the night of the annual Steve Irwin Gala in Las Vegas, an event built entirely around honoring her father's memory and raising money for wildlife warriors. Bindi had flown in for it. She'd posed for photos with her family outside the Bellagio the night before, dressed in the trademark khaki that's basically synonymous with her family's name. And then, hours before the event, her appendix ruptured. She still tried to push through it. According to her brother Robert, she showed up ready to attend, putting on a brave face despite visible pain, fully intending to get through the night the way she'd gotten through everything else for a decade, by not letting anyone see how much it hurt. It was the surgeon who ended that plan, telling her plainly that the appendix had to come out immediately, no negotiation. There was no version of that evening where she walked on stage. Her mother Terry made the call to skip the gala entirely, staying by Bindi's side through surgery and recovery instead of attending an event held in memory of her own late husband. That left Robert, 21 years old at the time, to host the room alone, explain the sudden absence of both his sister and his mother, and somehow carry the biggest night on the family calendar by himself. He told reporters that night that she was going to be okay, and admitted that out of everything the family had prepared for, this specific emergency wasn't one of them. Here's the detail that actually matters most in that whole night, though. In the hours between the diagnosis and the operating table, Bindi made a decision most people in an emergency would never think to make. Instead of heading into the nearest available hospital in Las Vegas, she got on another plane and flew to New York. Not out of stubbornness. Because her appendix, as she later explained, hadn't come out of nowhere. She described it as having been grumbly for months beforehand, a slow-building problem she'd been quietly managing the same way she'd learned to manage everything else. When it finally forced her hand, she called the one surgeon who already knew her case inside and out, Dr. Setkin, the same doctor from 2023. Together, they made a plan. If she flew to him, the surgical team could remove the appendix and, while they were already in there, check whether the endometriosis had come back. It had. About an hour after waking up from surgery, she posted a video from her hospital bed with an update that surprised a lot of people who'd assumed the 2023 procedure had closed the book on this. Her appendix was gone. Surgeons had also repaired a large hernia she'd been living with for 4 years, dating back to the birth of her daughter Grace. And then came the part that reframed the entire recovery story. 14 new endometriosis lesions found and removed during that same operation. 14 lesions that had grown back silently in the roughly 2 years since her first surgery, without producing symptoms severe enough on their own to send her back to a doctor. If her appendix hadn't ruptured that specific weekend, and if she hadn't specifically asked her surgeon to check while he was already operating, that tissue would likely still be growing inside her right now, completely undetected. Sit with that for a moment, because it says something important about how this disease actually works. The 2023 surgery that so many people, understandably, treated as the end of the story wasn't actually an ending at all. Excision surgery for endometriosis doesn't mean the disease is cured forever. It means it's cleared for now. It can return. In Bindi's case, it returned within about 2 years, and the only reason anyone found out was an unrelated medical emergency and a patient who'd learned, the hard way, to advocate hard for herself. That's a level of self-monitoring most people are never taught to have, and she built it after a decade of being told her pain wasn't worth investigating. Now hold 2 numbers in your head, 37, from 2023, and 14, from 2025. On August 13, 2025, Bindi posted a recovery update that quietly did the math for everyone. The total came to 51 separate lesions removed across 2 surgeries, alongside the chocolate cyst, her appendix, and the repaired hernia from childbirth. She wrote that she could finally function in daily life without wanting to throw up or pass out from pain, a sentence worth reading twice, because it reveals what her actual baseline had been for years. Not being in agony wasn't automatic for her. It was a goal she'd only just reached, at 27 years old, after a documented medical battle stretching back to her early teens. That brings us to this year, and to the photo that started this whole conversation. In March 2026, Bindi posted images of herself in a hospital bed again, and fans reacted exactly the way you'd expect, with alarm. But those photos weren't announcing a new crisis. They were memories from her past surgeries, shared deliberately because March is Endometriosis Awareness Month. In the caption, she reflected on the inescapable pain of having more than 50 lesions removed over the years and the feeling of being trapped inside her own body for a decade before anyone believed her. It wasn't a bulletin about a new emergency. It was advocacy, aimed at every woman currently sitting in an exam room being told to relax, the way she once was. Her message was direct: no one deserves to suffer in silence. Then came the gala again. On May 2, 2026, the third annual Steve Irwin Gala was held in Las Vegas, and for the second year running, Bindi wasn't there. Her mother Terry and her brother Robert attended and addressed the obvious question directly in an interview with E! News. And this time, the tone was completely different from 2025. Bindi is doing so much better now, Terry said, explaining that long-distance travel is still one of the more taxing things for her body during recovery, so she chose to stay home in Queensland rather than fly internationally for a single event. Robert echoed that sentiment in follow-up comments, calling his sister's willingness to keep sharing her story publicly a genuinely brave thing to do, and saying he was